All right. Hello, everyone. We're excited to kick off the Spring EP Distinguished Speaker Series with today's topic, Environmental Justice, the Past, the Present, and the Future, presented by Dr. Kelly Tzoumis. Before coming to academia almost 20 years ago, Dr. Kelly Tzoumis worked at the U.S. Department of Energy at 2 national laboratories in Washington, D.C. She has worked at several Superfund sites as a program manager, as well as an external liaison to communities working on remediation. She has also served as a congressional fellow for former Senator Simon on Capitol Hill and was distinguished chair for Fulbright in environmental studies. She has been invited to lecture worldwide on environmental policy and management issues, countries that have included China, Italy, Spain, and Greece. She is a leader in global online learning, working with 8 university partners on 4 continents, including our very own EP. Her recent book titled Toxic Chemicals in America, Controversies in Human and Environmental Health was published in 2021. She has many publications and teams with students to attend conferences and has them join her in publishing. Currently, she is working on a book with the Navajo Nation on nuclear waste and its legacy. She has numerous teaching awards and advising awards from several universities where she's taught. Her innovative teaching pedagogies include global game simulations, virtual reality lectures, and international policy debates on controversial issues regarding the environmental and human health. She is also leading a large funded effort to recruit students with disabilities and is working on disability as a DEI issue. She's a strong proponent of universal design and accessibility for students. She has spent almost 20 years as an accreditor for the Higher Learning Commission and serves as a reviewer for several journals. Dr. Tzoumis, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. I'll give the floor to you.
Well, thank you, Heather. Thank you for having me. And I'm really excited to bring to you today this discussion about environmental justice. I'm going to today look at the past, the present, and the future. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to look at how EJ, environmental justice, is defined, the early movement, which is extremely important in understanding environmental justice, how it is used in decision-making, the tools that EPA has specifically given people who want to include environmental justice or are required to include environmental justice in their decision-making. We're going to go over a couple of those tools. And then we're going to talk in an interesting way about what the current and future movement looks like. And then, of course, questions at the end. So let's start by defining environmental justice. Environmental justice is really important for our learners. It is helpful for them to understand how their decisions have impact and the consequences of their decision to communities that perhaps are not formally always included in the decision-making process. And so as we teach our students, as we think about the assignments that we build, hopefully we're also asking them to think in a meaningful way about the consequences of their work and their decision making. Environmental justice started off as a public policy defined in an executive order 12898. You can see here, this is the picture where President Clinton signs the executive order in 1994. And there's some very famous people around this particular picture. You can see Carol Browner from the US EPA, former head of the US EPA. You can see, we're going to talk a little bit about Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of environmental justice. You can see several of the people that I'm going to show you were in the original Warren County march, and they're there, as well as Al Gore. Vice President Al Gore was really the impetus behind this executive order. And of course, Carol Moseley Brown, former senator of Illinois. You can see Janet Reno also in the back. So this was a very important event. And when we define environmental justice, it starts with this executive order. And there's some key words here. And this is a key phrase from the executive order, that each federal agency, so this policy focuses on federal agencies, but it should be noted that any government, state and local government that is taking a significant portion of their funding, so think about roads and highways and other civil engineering projects from the federal government, have to comply as well with this executive order. The word disproportionately has been widely debated on what that means. This kind of disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental impacts is one that the EPA has struggled with. And then the focus is on minority population and low income. And that also includes our tribal nations. So there is a long history of environmental justice taking place. And here are some of the milestones that EPA has laid out. It kicks off in the early 1990s, and then we get the executive order in 1994. And there were several attempts to make this legislation prior to 1990 in the Black Caucus in the Congress, which failed. And so the executive order really starts the ball rolling in terms of public policy. Of course, then from there, every agency is required to have guidance in how they will incorporate EJ into their actions, particularly into draft environmental impact statements and to our different environmental permits. And it's been wonderful. Time has passed very quickly. I remember when this order came out, there's already been a 20-year anniversary. And so it's quite established now. Now, some concepts that have grown out of the environmental justice policy is this notion of overburdened communities. And this is something that EPA introduced. This is where we have multiple and cumulative impacts actually affecting an individual community. They also have introduced the notion of meaningful participation in decision-making and fair treatment. So what does fair treatment? Because that's a pretty tough concept to actually justify and to defend. Well, that no group bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences from the different federal actions. And meaningful involvement also is a concept that's really important here. And that is that the public's contribution actually impacts the agencies and different activities that are being proposed and that are taking place. And so that these decision makers actually seek out and help facilitate the involvement of a variety of people in the community, including those overburdened community members. Well, let's take a look at the early environmental justice movement. Many of you might be surprised by this. It is separate and it is different than the modern environmental movement. This movement, the modern environmental movement started, of course, we all know, in the 1960s and 70s, the creation of EPA in 1970, the creation of the Council on Environmental Quality. And what was interesting is one of the first reports from the Council on Environmental Quality was about urban poverty and its effect in terms of how the environmental contamination affects the urban poor. However, not much was done after that. And so we did have some catastrophes that helped make environmental justice move along on the policy agenda. For instance, Love Canal. Here is Lois Gibbs. I actually got a chance to have dinner with her, and she's a very interesting public policy player, and she was a self-proclaimed blue-collar wife. That's her own description. And you can see her house here, and you can see Love Canal here was built right by houses, and a school was actually put on there. These are her two young children that suffered consequences from the dioxin that was in Love Canal. And she went on to really be a strong advocate. As you know, Love Canal was evacuated under Jimmy Carter as an emergency action, and it has been remediated to a certain extent, and people have moved back into Love Canal. Lois went on to DC and created national nonprofit organizations to make sure that we do not have another Love Canal. So this was preceding Superfund and environmental justice, but it did start to show the low income community impact on environmental justice policy. This is one of the seminal events that is always cited in environmental justice, and this is the Warren County, North Carolina PCB disposal. So in 1982, trucks rolled into a primarily low income and Black community in Warren County. And we were far enough along now in our media attention that we had national news coverage. And that's really important for environmental justice because it generally affects the disenfranchised. So when we start having national media coverage, you know, the breaking news and the 24-hour coverage with cable TV, we start seeing more attention given to things like Warren County. So this is a wonderful event that really pushes EJ farther on the agenda towards that executive order. You can see these are some of the same people that were at the signing of the executive order. These are indeed original photos that were given to us by copyright. I actually found the young, at that time, young Duke University student who was a journalism major. Of course, now she's an adult working in journalism in the state of Indiana, and she still had these photos. These are her photos that she gave copyrights that I use in my class. And she actually was there. And so she took these pictures. And so these are originals that we were able to put into our class, as well as something that I use quite frequently in environmental justice. Before I play this, the next slide is actually going to start a chant. I was fortunate enough that the journalism student had a cassette of the chants that were being done. This is also very characteristic of the environmental justice movement. And so they're going to play now, and I got them digitized and put into my course. Take a look. Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round, I don't wanna let no piece of me. Turn me round, I'm gonna keep on walking, I keep on talking, marching on the freedom line. Fight up, fight up. Some of the really unique factors in the environmental justice movement, separate from the modern environmental movement, besides starting later outside of the 1960s and 70s, the environmental justice movement has strong contributions from players that were not always in the modern environmental movement. For instance, academia played a very strong role. The University of Michigan, two very famous professors that reached out and helped build a coalition for environmental justice was Dr. Bunyan Bryant, who I had the fortune to work with, and Dr. Paul Mohai. Both of these professors really built the coalition called the Michigan Coalition for University of Michigan, where they were at. And it included social scientists, civil rights activists, and religious leaders. And so this kind of unique combination was really important in understanding the early environmental justice movement. Here, what you see is two very important documents that started to quantify and bring empirical evidence into the environmental justice movement. On the right side is the 1987 Toxic Waste Report, and on the left side is an update to it from 1987 to 2007. And you can see some of those coalition members, as well as Charles Lee, who actually works with the Commission for Racial Justice underneath the United Church of Christ. So we have a religious institution actually leading this particular movement. Charles Lee then goes on to actually head up environmental justice and is still in EPA today. We're going to talk about him in a moment. I've also had the chance to interview him and record him and put him in my course. Now, Robert Bullard. Robert Bullard is a very famous early activist in academia, a sociologist, in fact, who writes about the dumping in Dixie. This book has become a mainstay in understanding environmental justice, and he's continued to revise it over the years. Robert Bullard and others actually were part of the delegates to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that took place in 1991. They developed these 17 principles that are still the foundation for the environmental justice movement. They marched on Washington and demanded that Congress provide attention in terms of public policy and appropriations for the environmental justice movement. And now environmental justice has really taken off. By 1992, the UN conference known as the Earth Summit, actually in Rio de Janeiro, has its first environmental justice delegation formally participating in the conference. Now, it hasn't been an easy road for environmental justice, as you can imagine, particularly with their relationship of the modern movement. In fact, in 1990, the environmental justice organization called SWOP, the Southwest Organizing Project, sent a pretty strong letter to the top 10 environmental modern movement organizations, Sierra Club, National Wilderness Society, all of the ones that you know from our modern environmental policies. And they were concerned that they were not being included, that civil rights and the social movements of the 1960s did not intersect with the environmental justice movement. And so this letter was really profound. This is a copy of the original letter, and it's called the Group of 10 letter because it was sent to the top 10 modern environmental groups. And it clearly outlined that they felt that the environmental justice movement was not actually including the developing South, what we call the developing South, and the issues of urban poor and other overburdened communities, low income and minority. More recently, Dr. Dorsetta Taylor, who was originally at University of Michigan and has returned to Yale as a professor in environmental justice. She also holds the distinguished title of being the first Black woman to actually graduate from Yale with 2 doctorates. So she has been invited back and is now there as a professor doing research. She's done a variety of research, picking up on seeing if any progress has been made since that Group of 10 letter. Has the modern movement incorporated environmental justice into its advocacy and policies, both organizationally as well as through the policies? And she has several publications. The first one is in 2014. She was very comprehensive in looking at the diversity of the environmental organizations. She found that only 6% actually reported on race and gender, and that mainly we did not see any movement of incorporating people of color or low income into these organizations. She then also checked again in 2018 to see if there was any improvement, and actually that number had dropped to 3% in 2018. Her most recent publication in the American Behavioralist in 2021 actually found that environmental groups were more likely to collect data than to actually divulge or report data on who makes the decisions in these organizations. The groups are not disclosing their DEI data as of recently as last year in her research findings. Now, this movement is a little bit different. I said that in the beginning. It takes on the motto, where we live, work, and pray. And so this play and pray. And so this movement is holistic. It includes housing issues, transit, fair wages, clean schools, healthy foods, access, and even more. And so the focus is on human health in the environment, and it's intimately tied to civil rights, religious groups, and academic groups. And the focus is on people of color and low income. So this is a pretty holistic approach. Now, how do we make decisions currently? What tools do we have? There's been some research, some of the research I was involved with years ago. I actually pulled all of the DISs with a research team. They were housed in a repository at Northwestern University Library in the government section. And we actually read through each one looking for the environmental justice section that is required from the executive order. And what we found was we looked at over 2,000 documents that got produced of draft EISs, and only about half actually included an analysis on low income. The major producers of these documents, of course, was the Federal Highway Administration, Forest Service, Army Corps of Engineers, and the state of California had the highest number percentages of EJ analysis. But unfortunately, 93% of the DEISs concluded that there was no impact, which we know could not possibly be true. And so half of the documents had some empirical information. The other half just merely stated, without really any evidence or any even qualitative information, that they've concluded there was absolutely no impact without any kind of justification. And at this time, only about 57% use spatial tools. Now, remember, EJ analysis is also required in permitting. And so we pulled the RCRA permits. And so again, a research team of students and I went in and we looked at the hazardous waste permits, and we found that EPA was only looking at 1 mile from the facility for their social demographics of income and race. And we then went farther. We analyzed at 2 miles, 4 miles, and 5 miles from the RCRA facility. And indeed, we did find environmental justice issues that EPA was missing because they limited their social demographics to the 1 mile area. And we strongly recommended the more use of GIS and the TRI data, not just census tract data that was currently being used. Well, EPA actually responded. And somebody from EPA actually came and hunted me down in Chicago. He's at Region 5. And I actually interviewed him on a green screen and included him. We're good friends. And we talked about what was needed. And so 2 things have come out of environmental justice as tools for our students and for professionals, and they're freely available. First is called EJ Screen. It was initiated in 2015, and NEPA Assist in 2012. I'll start with NEPA Assist. NEPA Assist is a wonderful tool. It's very visual and it's geospatial. And so it looks at a variety of these different types of variables, and it includes TRA, Superfund, brownfields, and it includes water, air, hazardous waste, and of course the demographics. So this is an interactive tool that my students do assignments on in class, and they can actually move around the US and see this is a map that actually is interactive and can see the different impacts of these contaminants to the different demographics. EJ Screen is even better for working with environmental justice. And the EJ Screen has 11 variables that are taken into account. You can see them here. And it builds an EJ index that EPA uses. And this index includes demographics, population counts, and as well as looking at these 11 potential risks. Now, I mentioned Charles Lee, who was part of the United Church of Christ report. He actually managed those early 1987 toxic waste reports and his follow-up. And he has moved many years ago, moved into EPA, and he is very active. I've interviewed him recently and put him into my course, and he is very passionate about this. And here's a recent article from 2021 where he really strongly encourages the use of geospatial tools for understanding cumulative impacts. And of course, the Biden administration also strongly has supported environmental justice screening, particularly with California's model of using a screening tool that they have. So what is the current movement and where are we going? The current movement is really interesting because it's actually combining with the energy justice movement and the climate justice movement. So environmental justice has become very global, and it's taken into account more things than just contamination, particularly as they move into overlapping with energy justice. Of course, these other movements have different tenets. The energy justice, if you ever read any literature on the energy justice, you'll find a real pattern of looking at distributional, procedural, and recognition justice. And so it's actually given Robert Bullard, who is now moving into energy justice, a great deal to think about beyond the environmental justice movement. Now, the current movement has tackled things like mountaintop removal. You can see here in the right corner, this mountain in Appalachia has been removed. It was thought in the race to get clean coal and to stop mining and to have cheaper costs to remove some of these mountaintops. And of course, what we found is these took place in some of our poorest communities in the US and changed actually the temperature because of the loss of shade coverage and foliage. And so this has been a real problem. This is a permanent change in the mountain. This is what this mountain looks like. I've contacted the Southwest pilots who have a large grant, and they fly over these, take pictures, and gave me full access to these pictures that I use when I teach. The other really interesting issue is the legacy from World War II and us mining uranium. This legacy continues today, and I work with the Navajo Nation. Our recent 10-year plan came out. Previously, Congress asked for 2 5-year plans from EPA, and now this is the 10-year plan. This is the 3rd plan, and they did extend it for 10 years. And these mines are not completely remediated. We are working on those, and the Navajo Nation is really struggling because of the lack of resources in trying to be an active participant in cleaning up and being a decision maker in EPA's approach to these legacy uranium mines. And finally, the Biden administration has really pulled up an old problem in the environmental justice movement called Cancer Alley. This is where the Mississippi River goes between approximately, New Orleans and Baton Rouge. That area is really contaminated, and you can see President Biden and the United Nations Human Rights have recognized Cancer Alley as a problem in human rights. And so President Biden, soon after he got in February 2021, issued a statement here in the Federal Register about spurring on both economic development and the cleanup of this very large petrochemical area. Future, what are we doing in the future? I think this is really exciting. We are, of course, like I said, moving into other areas like energy justice and climate justice. But what's really interesting, this is convergence. We're converging with other policy areas like renewable energies. But what's even more interesting is the intersectionality that's happening to the environmental justice movement. They are moving forward, recognizing things like gender and gender identification. And so this environmental justice movement is really expanding its scope in terms of understanding who they represent and who they advocate for. It is very much a DEI community, and very much a community that is embracing decision-making by those that are impacted. And so you can see the wonderful visuals here, very different than the modern environmental movement, and very much grounded in human rights, civil rights, and human justice. I want to conclude on one area that is part of this intersectionality that has often been neglected, and I do quite a bit of work now in this area, and that is the disability community. And so many times, and this is from the Environmental Health News in August 2021, talking about, what about environmental justice and disability? In the past, we've always left disabled people out of both the modern environmental movement and I think you could also say the environmental justice movement. And so disability justice is moving across our academic institutions, both in Europe and in the US. Our students are very interested in it. We're seeing curriculum in it, disability studies, and students that are really wanting to engage in it. And so I think the future for environmental justice is also going to be about focusing on how these environmental injustices can cause disability. And instead of treating disabled people as the ecological other, which is what the literature talks about, treating them as something different, grounded in what's called the ecological other theory. Disabled people are becoming much more active. And so unfortunately, the disabled community feels that disability has been conflated with disease and environmental justice, and that's something that is recognized as a DEI and an inclusive community that should be part of the decision makings regarding environmental justice. And of course, this community very strongly will tell you nothing about us without us. And my students will very strongly tell me, we are not learners with disabilities. The person first language is from a past generation. They want to be called disabled learners. And in fact, they wear t-shirts and have campaigns saying disability is not a dirty word. So a lot is changing. It's an exciting field. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tzoumis. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. At this time, we can open the Q&A. You can either submit a question through the Q&A option at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask a question live. And while we wait for any of those to come through, we do have some pre-submitted questions that we can ask that participants submitted in advance. So I'll start with one of those. The first one is from Brandon Dell. And Brandon asks, what are some of the leading efforts for sustainability and what problems are they trying to solve?
Right. So sustainability is one of those convergent areas with environmental justice. However, there's parts of sustainability, particularly the economics part, that is less akin as a cousin to environmental justice. I think the SDGs through the United Nations very clearly tries to be inclusive. It does mention poverty, urban poor. It mentions communities with disabilities. And so I do think that sustainability plays an overlapping, converging role with environmental justice. However, it does have some unique barriers, in some unique, I should say, pillars of what sustainability is that is somewhat different than the environmental justice movement and the energy justice movement and the climate justice movement. I hope I answered your question, because I could go into great detail about this, but I would take up all the time.
Thank you. It looks like we have John Monroe who has his hand raised. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, John, so you can feel free to ask a question.
By the way, John is a long-term colleague of mine from the U.S. Department of Energy. Go ahead, John.
I think, John, you're on mute though, so you'll need to unmute yourself. But I gave you permission to speak once you do. There you go.
Okay, Kelly, great presentation. It's good to see you again. You look great.
Thank you, John.
Now, I have a problem with this whole concept of environmental justice. Isn't it really a subset of social justice or injustice? And moreover, to resolve the environmental justice issue, which may be more of a symptom than a fundamental causal situation, don't we really have to address social justice?
Yeah, John and I are often on the same page. Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the big differences that you saw in my presentation in how environmental justice is framed differently. And the environmental justice participants, like in that group of 10, specifically called out the modern movement. And you're absolutely right. The environmental justice movement is really a social justice and civil rights grounded movement by these overburdened communities to have a seat at the table of the decision making. And so I agree. And I think that's one of the big differences of the different movements is environmental justice is grounded with the religious overtones, and religious organizations made big strides for the environmental justice community. I mean, those were the two first major reports were from the United Church of Christ by Ben Chavez, who was head of the United Church of Christ. You can't deny that it is a social justice and civil rights movement. Absolutely.
Great, thank you, John. Are you, is that the end of your question or do you have anything else to ask?
Well, I just like to state that, I mean, are we better off? I mean, ultimately, resolution of environmental justice issues will be contingent on our ability to address social justice in a broader sense.
I agree. And I think that's what the UN did when they went from the Millennium Goals into the SDGs. You saw, I think, a big step forward in them trying to integrate social justice into our sustainability goals.
Okay.
I see tangible evidence of what you're saying by the UN in those sustainable development goals. But I got to tell you, energy justice starts there. they start with restorative justice. They start with distributional justice, procedural justice. So it's really interesting because the environmental justice movement was not grounded in these types of concepts of restorative justice. They didn't articulate it that way. Energy justice starts that way. And so I see progress. I see progress taking place in these different movements going on.
Right.
Nice to hear from you, John.
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like we have another pre-submitted question, and this one's going to be from Deborah Copsey. She asks, what can be done to build resilience into low-income communities to combat climate change impacts?
Yeah. Hi, Deborah. It's good to hear from you too, one of my colleagues. You know, that's like the lottery question as we talk about climate justice. What can we do to build, and how do we teach resilience in our courses so that we can get professionals out there leading their communities and state and local government? I don't have that answer. I do know it starts with better planning, and better planning that works with the environmental terrain and climate, instead of building houses on the edge of the Mississippi, or perhaps in hurricane zones, or building large structures where there's water scarcity. I mean, I think we're going to have to start listening. We're going to have to start listening and watching and planning that. So I think it's a planning function of how do we, really plan out for climate change. Right now, we're not doing that so well. I think Katrina kind of showed us that. I think we're definitely all much more aware of it than we have been in the last 10 years, even though it's been progressing. I think the SDGs, again, the United Nations and the global community is understanding that resilience is needed. NSF does have some big grants on resilience in climate change. And I think we will get more of that as we move forward. I think resilience is going to be at the top. Resilience planning is going to be at the top of our curriculum very soon. Very soon. I do see some job postings too, not just for sustainability. We've had those for quite a while. Resilience planning in local government. I'm starting to see some position descriptions on resilience. So I think we're going to have to think differently about that real soon. Nice to hear from you, Deb.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, the next question is going to come from Alexis Hughes, and she asks, what are useful ways of quantifying cost benefits of various energy sources?
Okay. I love this topic. So and I have an article coming out with both the Navajo Nation and France about this topic on energy justice, and presenting another one in March on energy justice. We do not calculate the cost of disposal. We do not, of course, everyone knows here and what a negative externality is in economics. We don't price our goods with the costs of those prices in terms of to the environment, to the ecosystem, to public health, and to the future. We really lack any kind of cost benefit analysis that includes intergenerational justice regarding energy. And so we've got to teach cost benefit differently. We're going to have to move it out of the purely economics realm and understand that negative externalities exist. And we're going to have to include those cost benefits at the front end as well as at the back end. Right now, we tend to look at a very narrow slice when we do cost benefit analysis. We don't include climate. We don't include transitions into new energy sources. And certainly, there was no cost benefit at looking at mountaintop removal to that community, or to the Navajo's legacy that is still going on. And so I think what has to happen is we have to be much more comprehensive in our mathematics in what variables we include in cost benefit analysis. So I think that's where we have to start. And climate change and waste disposal, and trying to include those negative externalities both on the front end and the back end of whatever energy source as we move forward, that we including renewables. I'm a big proponent at thinking about how we're going to dispose of these renewables, and perhaps planning for some recycling or reclamation of these photovoltaic solar panels, as well as the wind turbines, looking at ways that we can now, as we're laying them out in full force at fast rates, that we don't make the same mistakes we did, like for instance with mountaintop removal, where it was thought to be expedient and lower sulfur and coal that was fast and wouldn't impact miners. And now we've got mountains that are completely cut off in Appalachia and impacting those communities in terms of health outcomes. So I'm hoping that we start thinking a little bit longer term, okay, than one generation, which of course waste disposal requires you to do, and a little bit more understanding of all of the costs to the ecosystem, not just a narrow definition of those costs. So again, I have a couple publications coming out with some global partners on that, directly dealing with those kinds of issues, and kind of the narrow-mindedness that we've taken in terms of understanding risks and costs for our future energy uses.
Kelly, Walter Montalvo, sorry if I butchered your last name, Walter, has a follow-up question to that. Do you have any examples of good cost benefit analysis?
No, I don't, particularly with environmental. That's one of my points in the publications coming out. The biggest problem is cost benefit is very narrow, and it begins maybe with the construction. They'll have the construction and some of the operation, but not the closure. The closure costs are not usually in there. The waste disposal is not in there. So I know I don't have a good example, because we've been pretty focused and containing what those costs are. Usually when I came through my economics courses at the PhD and master's level, it was benefits, right, that we couldn't quantify. We were always told, oh, you can't, how do you quantify clean air? How do you quantify health, clean water? And so my economists told me, okay, it's benefits that's harder. But what they were neglecting to look at was the comprehensiveness of making sure we had all the costs in there, and intergenerationally, not just from the building and short operational life of a particular plant, but also then the closure and then the impacts of that waste disposal into future generations. So no, I don't have one that really is comprehensive, and I think that's where some of the change has to take place. And nothing that I've seen has had really good climate change, intergenerational justice for energy, and climate change incorporated into that cost benefit analysis.
Thank you, Kelly. Susan Weirman asks, what role do you see for improving cumulative impact assessments or cumulative risk assessment in improving environmental justice?
Hi, Susan. I remember you from, I think, faculty gatherings in the past. I think that, well, first of all, just like EPA has said, you've got to get the environmental justice communities involved with the development of these risk models. And that's not easy because we talk different vocabulary. However, when I work with the Navajo Nation, they want to be involved, and they want to have some decision-making over their future, just as any other community in the US would. And so I think where we have to start is beginning by involving the affected parties, and not just producing a permit and then showing them, or writing a DEIS, which is very long. And even with the technical advisory groups that EPA will fund, not sufficient. These folks are wanting to be in on the ground floor of the decision making. And so if we're going to talk about risk, we can't calculate risk separate from the people who bear the risk. Okay. And I think that's what we've been doing. We put them in a review and comment mode that can last for very long, or we put them in having to work on permits and either have them try to defend the permit or protest the permit. And then we go into an arbitration situation, almost a tribunal. I did an article on this a few years ago, looking at EPA's data on their permitting. And it's very hard to overturn a permit at EPA. I mean, historically, it's rare. And so I think if we can get to actually involving the people who bear the risk into the decision making and the calculation of that risk, I think that's the first step.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, we're at our last question from the pre-submitted list. So if anyone from the audience has any additional questions, please drop them in the chat or raise your hand. The last question from the pre-submitted is from Dae-Hyun Lee. And Dae-Hyun asks, what are the motives for companies to invest in ESG? And how do we help developing countries to invest in ESG?
And please define ESG so I don't misunderstand your question.
Oh, it's a pre-submitted one, so I'm not sure, Kelly.
Is he there?
I don't think I see him on the list. No.
Oh, I don't know
We
for
can
sure what
skip it
he's
then.
referring to as ESG.
Sure. All right, well, with that, I just want to point out in the chat, John Monroe is referencing, so he says, for new tools related to resilience and cost benefit analysis, explore the National Institute of Standards tool for communities called EDGE, EDGES, I guess, with a $sign. I believe that Jennifer Helgeson from NIST will be speaking in the series in spring, and that is correct. Dr. Helgeson will be joining us in April, so we'll be announcing that next month. And so, yeah, we'll be looking forward to that. So hopefully folks who were interested in hearing about that will join us again in April. And it looks like Alicia has a question for you, Kelly.
Well, no, I just did a quick Google search and ESG came up as meaning environmental, social, and governance. Does that make any sense in terms of that question?
Yeah, could you, that's not something that I'm familiar with as a standard acronym, but could you reread the question now that I have the definition?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, what are the motives for companies to invest in ESG, and how do we help developing countries to invest in ESG?
This is a really good question. So as part of my book that just came out in 2021, I pulled the top 10 chemical companies, both globally, because these are the polluter, a big source of the pollution, and the top 10 in the US. And there's quite a bit of a lack of cleanup and prevention that is taking place. These are big companies that have big, it's in the billions of dollars of risk in terms of environmental sustainability and cleanup. So my answer would be companies could prevent quite a bit. When I read DuPont and Dow, because they were separate and then they merged, and then of course I saw in their Security Exchange Commission reports that was not going to stay as a merger. They just could not. I could see in the financials that it wasn't going to happen. But so they split again. But they take with them those Superfund burdens and the cleanup burdens, and they're, like I said, in the billions. It takes away from their bottom line, and so I can leave environmental justice to the side for a moment and all of the civil rights and social justice reasons. And when I move into the corporate world, which is what you've asked me to do, it is beneficial for them economically to not have these long-standing contamination sites that cost them billions to clean up. And so it's an investment that is done in the beginning of projects and not after the projects. And so planning for things that are environmentally sustainable is the way that I think the private sector hopefully will start moving to, because the costs on the outside after, it's a legacy that continued. These Dow Chemical and Monsanto and the other companies that I looked at, these were long-term problems that they had, that as companies merged and then separated, it followed them, and they don't go away. And so I think, and there's in the SEC filings, there's an environmental risk that each company has to actually declare to the federal government. And they're large for these, larger chemical companies. And so I would say, to answer you, that some pre-planning and prevention actually yields a bottom line that is profitable for industry. And so hopefully I would love to see some tax incentives and some government incentives to do that planning and to invest early on to prevent the kinds of contaminants that we have coming out of industry.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. We did have one more question pop up in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay.
As we transition to clean energy in the US, what do you view as the largest negative impacts on vulnerable communities, both in the US and abroad?
Well, I mean, the energy justice movement is really very closely watching this transition, and the literature is pretty clear. There's some literature out there on the Black Lives Matters movement and solar energy coming out of Yale, which is outstanding. It's an article that's outstanding. So I think, again, involving people of color, people in these overburdened communities, and people that are impacted into the decision making is key. So as we moved into renewables, we have to think about not repeating the same mistakes that we made with fossil fuels. And that's one of the things I'm concerned about and I write about. In that expeditious race to be net carbon neutral, which is very important, but we are perhaps taking shortcuts, and time is of the essence because we waited too long, of course. But I worry, and so does the energy justice movement. I'm watching for this carefully. Are we doing things now that are going to be our future Superfund sites later, and our disproportionate impact sites later as we race into renewables, both solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear? And are we greenwashing some of these practices because we have not thought about disposal? We have not thought about reuse. We have not thought about recycling. We're still doing, 20, 25 years for a solar panel, and we haven't thought about perhaps making them reusable or sustainable in terms of recycling, or how we're going to dispose of the many solar panels that are covering our desert. And so I hope we're not greenwashing them in a race to get to carbon neutrality, because all we're doing is shifting burdens, and those burdens generally fall on the environmental justice communities, both in the global South and in the Western democracies. So I've been writing on this. I'm very concerned about something just came out. In fact, last week, it was a wonderful graphic about having tunnel vision for carbon neutrality, that we are generating, just like the mountaintop removal, just like the uranium mining, that we're generating a whole new legacy of intergenerational justice issues that the future human race will have to contend with. So I'm so glad we finally know that climate is a problem, and we know that carbon is a problem, but we also have to look at the environment as an ecosystem, and we have to look at these social justice issues, that we may be transferring those risks to communities that are still not able to be at the table making the decisions for what they want to take on in terms of their risks and burdens.
Thanks so much, Kelly. We really appreciate all your time and expertise. This has been very insightful. I learned a lot. So hope maybe you'll join us again in the future, and would love to hear more about your upcoming publication. So thank you. I wanted just to close by letting everyone know our next Distinguished Speaker Series session will be March 16th. Which is a Wednesday instead of our normal Thursday at 4 p.m. Dr. Daniel Sperling, who is the Distinguished Professor of Civil Engineering and Environmental Science and Policy from UC Davis, will be joining us. He's also the director of the Institute of Transportation Studies. His topic will be the path to transportation decarbonization. So hopefully everyone who enjoyed this topic may join us for the next topic, and we look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, if you have any questions about this series, please feel free to email me directly. And again, just want to extend our gratitude to Kelly for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.